Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my surprises and disappointments for the San Jose Sharks throughout the 24-25 season. And starting off on the surprise side of things, we have young rookie forward Macklin Celebrini. And this might be a little bit controversial because I do know there were a lot of people who had some very high expectations for Celebrini coming into this season. Back in September, at the beginning of the year, I had made a bold prediction video, and one of them was that Celebrini would end up as a Calder finalist in a really tough year for rookies, which was this season. And many people felt as though that actually wasn't bold at all, and it was almost a given that he would finish in that top 3 position. But I wasn't as fully convinced, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that leading up into the 2023 draft, there was a ton of hype and a ton of excitement behind projected first overall pick Connor Bedard. People thought he was going to end up being the next McDavid, and indeed, he had a very strong rookie season on a terrible Chicago Blackhawks team, putting up, I believe, 61 points. With going into the 2024 draft, the hype levels could really only drop down. And so many people said, yeah, Celebrini is a great player, but he's no Connor Bedard. And so you would think that the point totals would come in at least a little bit lower than what Bedard did. On top of that, the other reason is that Celebrini, 18-year-old forward, it's not an easy thing to make that adjustment to the NHL. In fact, Celebrini is quite young. He is still 18, even though the season has already finished. And while Bedard was kind of an exception to this rule, if you go back to some of the previous first overall forward talents before him, Slavkovsky, Lafreniere, Jack Hughes, it took a year or a couple of years for those players to really adjust to the NHL level. You'd have to go back to like 2017 with Nico Hischier or 2016 with Austin Matthews to really find players who were able to make that immediate impact. And they were able to do so on playoff teams, the Devils and the Leafs. For Celebrini, he's on the worst team in the league and the lowest scoring team in the league, the San Jose Sharks. And so for him to come in and put up 63 points, not only matching Bedard, but perhaps even surpassing him as well, was exceptionally impressive. Pretty much right out of the gate, he showed himself as one of the best players on the Sharks roster, and it did not take very long for him to assert himself as the best player on the roster. Warsofsky quickly recognized this. Celebrini was the player who was double shifted or kept on the ice for 2-3 minutes long when trying to catch up in games, down a goal, down a couple of goals. He was the guy. He would get the major ice time. He was the player that the Sharks leaned on as an 18-year-old rookie. And again, because he's so young, you really only expect him to get better from here. So for me, this was a surprising and outstanding rookie season from Celebrini. Then we move on to the Sharks' other big-name rookie player, that one being Will Smith. Now, on the surface, you might not think that this was all that surprising of a year for him. I would say people who are at least mostly optimistic about Smith's performance this year would say that they predicted him to get about 40-ish points. And that's around where he finished up with 45 points to close out the season. But it was really how he got these point totals that caught people a bit off guard. Because back at the beginning of the season, it's no secret that he had a very slow start. October, November really didn't treat him all that kindly, and there were calls, including from myself, to potentially send him down to the Barracuda, let him build up a little bit of confidence there, and then in a couple of weeks return him up to the NHL and see what he can do. But the Sharks, they stuck with him the entire time, and it was a slow process at first. Started off with not really making much of an impact. Then occasionally he could have one game here or there where he would play rather well. But it was once we got to mid-January with a game against the Boston Bruins where a switch just immediately flipped, and suddenly Smith was not only a pretty good player, but one of the best offensive talents on the Sharks roster to end out that season. It was such a quick transition that it really just came out of nowhere and was a complete surprise. And there were certain aspects back at the beginning of the season that you would expect him to get better at. He wasn't playing with much pace, not much speed. He wasn't moving his feet all that much at the beginning of the season. You think that by the end, by February, by March, that he'll be better in this particular area. But one thing that you knew that wouldn't really be able to improve much was his strength as a player. He just didn't really have much behind him. He couldn't contest all that much the other players in the league in 50-50 puck battles. And throughout when you're playing, a game every other day, you don't really have the time to work on your strength and conditioning. It's more so a target that you have for yourself in the off season offseason when you can truly put on, 10, 15 pounds of muscle or whatever the case may be. So this was something that Smith wasn't really going to be able to improve on. But what he did do is adapt his game where this no longer was a massive issue for himself because he could avoid having to constantly get into these puck battle situations. Now, is this an optimal case? Not quite. If in 3 years' time we're still talking about this, then it's probably a problem. But right now, when you're just trying to find like mid-season solutions, it was actually a really, really good idea. So you look at, let's say, Will Smith on the forecheck, he's not laying the body, he's not trying to separate man from puck by laying a big body check, but instead he's coming in, he's attacking with his stick, with good positioning in that area. He's trying to maybe put himself in a spot where instead of these 50-50 puck battles, it's now 80-20 puck battles where he can actually be very advantaged even if he doesn't have that strength, or just simply kind of floating up high in the offensive zone to pick off of a breakout pass. These are moments that we saw throughout the final 3 months of the season that he was able to succeed in, stripping the puck from a really good defenseman in Mackenzie Weegar with the Calgary Flames, or picking off a pass down low from a Predators defenseman and quickly converting it into a Colin Graff goal. These types of moments were not apparent at all at the beginning of the season, but became commonplace near the end of it. And so Smith, the real big surprise was how quickly he was able to adapt to the NHL and turn things around for him this season, which projects out really, really well moving forward to have that high of a hockey IQ. And then finally, we have Sharks defensive prospect Shakir Mukhamadullin. Now, unlike the previous two, there weren't massive expectations on this player coming into the season. He was originally acquired in the Timo Meier trade at the 22-23 trade deadline, and at the time, he was viewed as maybe like this second pairing defenseman of the future, and many thought as though he would make his full-time NHL debut in 23-24. That didn't quite end up happening. He only played about 3 games that year, and so then again, you're pushing it back a little bit and thinking that, okay, now he's for sure going to be that full-time guy this season. And at the start of the year, due to an injury, he didn't play in preseason, he didn't play in training camp or anything of that nature, and so he didn't start the year in the NHL, instead with the Barracuda, where he had a very slow start to the year. And so now maybe you're losing a little bit of faith in Mukhamadullin, some people dropping him in their prospect depth charts, having him get surpassed by other players. But when he eventually made his way up to the NHL in the latter half of this season, he was really, really impressive. He worked his way from a third pair to a first pair, and obviously this is because of the fact that the Sharks traded away a couple of guys ahead of him, like Ceci and in particular Jake Wallman, but he doesn't get bumped up here if Warsofsky didn't feel as though he deserved it, and he absolutely did. The poise that he showed and just the level of calmness that he showed on the ice was really, really impressive and also quite unusual for a young defenseman. You see it with guys like Thrun and with guys like Jack Thompson. They can be a little bit hesitant, maybe be overthinking themselves because it's tough to play defense at this highest level, to have to defend against the best players in the world. You start to question yourself, maybe a little bit of self-doubt, and you're thinking about things, even just briefly, oh, should I contest this player behind the net or maybe stay in front of my own net? Should I try and attack physically or maybe tie them up along the boards or hang back a little bit and attack with my stick? These types of just half-second hesitations will add up, and the game is going to pass you by. But for Shakir Mukhamadullin, he just seems to go with the flow. He plays based off of instinct, and it's not as though everything is perfect. He can still make mistakes, especially once he got bumped up to that top pairing, going up against, McKinnon in Colorado or Ovechkin in Washington. It's not an easy thing to handle. These are tough players to defend against, and there were giveaways and there were mistakes being made. But in the game surrounding that, when you look past the mistakes, there was just so much to love about his performance here that to me, he's just shot himself up the depth charts. I view him as a penciled-in top 4 guy for the San Jose Sharks heading into next season. Now, this shoulder injury that he sustained near the end of the year, that does complicate things a little bit. We don't know how much of an effect that this is going to have on his potential off-season training. We do know he had surgery for it, so he's likely out for a decent bit of time. And for a player as young as Mukhamadullin, who does have to work on his strength, like in the case with Will Smith throughout this off-season, you're hoping that he's not going to be held out for too long. But as long as things progress as you would expect, I guess, if this injury doesn't end up being too much of an issue, I am hoping for really big things from this player next year. Now we move on to the disappointment side of things. We start off with the duo of Barclay Goodrow and Ty Dellandre. You could theoretically just have the entirety of the Sharks' bottom 6 in this position, but it was these two players who I think stood out above the rest as the Sharks' major disappointments. Starting with Barclay Goodrow, he was a player who you really didn't expect much of, pretty much as soon as the Sharks acquired him. He was having a really bad season with a President's Trophy winning New York Rangers. Like, his stats were by far the worst on the team. And then despite putting up some clutch goals for them in the playoffs that year off of an exceptionally high shooting percentage, they still felt the need to get rid of him. And the Sharks, for whatever reason, decided to jump at the opportunity to pick him up off of waivers. And one would think that if his stats were already quite bad on a really good President's Trophy winning Rangers team, that they were not going to get any better playing on now the worst team in the league that we also know Barclay Goodrow didn't want to be on in the first place. But at the very least, if the stats were sort of just stagnant, it wouldn't have been the end of the world, but somehow they got even worse. Goodrow was a huge net negative for the Sharks when he was on the ice. They were outshot, they were outchanced, they were outscored, they were out expected goals. Pretty much every possible advanced stat that you can look at under the sun, he was right at the bottom in. Even just in plus minus, which is like very bare bones, he was a minus 37, which was the worst on the entire team and fourth worst in the entire league. And at the very least with the Rangers, you could kind of excuse it a little bit because he was also used very much in defensive roles. He had the highest defensive zone face-off percentage out of any player on the Rangers that year in terms of where he started on the ice in his shifts. But on the Sharks, he's actually in the lower half. Players like Celebrini and Eklund and Toffoli have a higher zone start percentage in the defensive zone than Goodrow has. He mostly started in the neutral zone, and it just ends up trending towards the defensive zone because he just doesn't push the pace forward. And so Goodrow right now, again, the expectations weren't very high, but the fact is that you could literally make the argument this year that he is the worst player in the entire league when it comes to 5-on-5 play. That can be nothing except disappointing. When it comes to Ty Dellandrea, he's almost like feels a little bit worse because I would say the expectations were not high for Dellandrea, but you hoped that there could be something there. It was only a couple of years ago where he played a full 82-game season with a strong Dallas Stars team as a 22-year-old in the NHL. He put up close to 30 points. He had 9 goals, over 14 minutes of ice time. He played a decent amount for them in the playoffs as well. That would, look quite good for a young player. But it was a worrying sign when he took a significant step back the following season. He played less minutes, he put up less points, he played less games, generally didn't look as clean, but still not the end of the world for a young guy to show some inconsistencies. But once the Sharks brought him in, that downward trend continued, and we again saw from Ty Dellandrea really not all that much. I had hoped that he could be like a leader on the Sharks' fourth line in terms of like the best player on the line, but not very much the case at all. Defensively, he struggled. He took a bunch of penalties. Physically was really the only portion of the game that he had some success in at 5-on-5, and that's not really enough to move the needle. And what ends up making this worse is the circumstances that the Sharks actually acquired Dellandrea. This isn't quite his fault, but it does make it feel bad, because the Sharks traded a 4th-round pick to pick up Dellandrea from the Stars, a 4th-round pick that was from the Winnipeg Jets that they had acquired a couple of years earlier when they traded the Jets Vladislav Nemesnikov, who they had picked up a couple of days prior to that in a trade for Mikey Eyssimont. And for those who remember Eysimont's performance with the San Jose Sharks, it was actually really impressive. He looked like a very solid bottom 6 guy, a Mike Greer type of player who for whatever reason they decided to get rid of. And so now you can connect this trade tree. It is essentially Eyssimont for Dellandrea, and that is a massive downgrade. Moving on to the next disappointing player, we have Henry Thrun, kind of like a diverging player from Shakir Mukhamadullin. While Mukhamadullin trended significantly upwards this season, Thrun has fallen down. And I remember when the Sharks originally acquired Henry Thrun from the Anaheim Ducks a couple of years ago, the major reason why he wasn't going to sign with Anaheim was because he felt as though there was not a path for him to get into actual NHL games. And if you take a look at the Ducks defense these days, you could sort of see what he had going for him. He was kind of right about that, but for the Sharks, there really weren't many competing names. They had just acquired Mukhamadullin a couple of days earlier from acquiring Thrun, but there was no Cagnoni, there's no Dickinson, there's no Polkamp, there's no Jack Thompson. All of those players had yet to be acquired by the Sharks. Thrun was basically the main name within the defensive prospect system. And he played right out of the gate his first debut game against the Vegas Golden Knights, the team that would end up winning the Stanley Cup that season, was extremely impressive. And while that was kind of like the peak of that season, it still showed that he had the ability to play at a relatively high level. The 23-24 season was expected to be kind of like a first full season for him where he'd be able to have some success. That didn't quite work out, but it was somewhat excusable first full-time season on a terrible, terrible Sharks team. Everybody on that team really, really struggled significantly. So you sort of pick out Thrun and say, oh, well, he was even worse. That wasn't particularly fair. But coming into the 24-25 season, where many different players actually took massive step forwards in their game, and the team as a whole looked a good bit better, even if results-wise it wouldn't show that, Thrun ended up stagnating. He played 60 games this season. He missed a decent amount due to injury, but in the games that he did play, he just looked very similar. Even if there was like slight progress, it's not really enough to get excited about. As I mentioned when discussing Mukhamadullin, Thrun just seems like a player who is filled with self-doubt, and while he will occasionally have good games, there are games where he's just making these mistakes, and the problem is that they're not just bad games, but they are really awful games. When it rains, it pours. When it comes to Henry Thrun, he gets into a couple of mistakes. It seems as though he gets into his own head, and it just cascades and snowballs from there, where he ends up being like the worst player on the ice on a relatively consistent basis. And so for Henry Thrun, like I said, his goal coming to the Sharks was to get that ice time, and the Sharks were able to give it to him these past couple of years, but I don't know if that's going to be continuing to be the case going into next season. The Sharks have Ferraro, Liljegren, Deharnay, and likely to be Mukhamadullin all under contract, all players who I would prefer to have play above Henry Thrun just from like a baseline perspective of talent, and you expect that Mike Greer will be bringing in at least a couple of more players to also be above Thrun, and then you also have Vlasic there for another season, and you also potentially have Dickinson and Cagnoni making a run to make the team. Thrun's position in this lineup is no longer a sure thing, is no longer secure. He's kind of squandered his last couple of years as an opportunity to try and become a consistent player on this roster. I'm not giving up hope with Henry Thrun, but this was not the year that he needed to have. And then finally, we have the Sharks power play, finished 26th in the league this season. And one might think that that's not completely terrible, especially in the context of the fact that the Sharks were the lowest scoring team in the entire league. Could you really have expected them to finish much higher? Well, if we take a look at the 23-24 season, that was a year in which the Sharks scored 180 goals. That is 28 less than what they ended up scoring this season, barely more than 2 per game. It was just absolutely terrible, and yet their power play found some success, 21st in the league that season at over 20%. So to see them add Celebrini and add Smith and to add Toffoli and add Jake Wallman all to their power play to not only bolster the top unit, but also give depth to a second unit that no longer had to feature Luke Cunnin and Justin Bailey and these types of players, it was supposed to see at the very least remaining at the same level, if not improvement. And yet the Sharks power play got worse. To me, the big issue for them is that it was just too structured, right? You want a structured penalty kill, but you want your power play to be a little bit more free-flowing, and that is not really the case at all. It was just too predictable for the Sharks throughout much of this season. When Jake Wallman has the puck, you know pretty much what his options are and what he's going to do. He's either going to pass it to his flanks or he's going to look for like a slap shot on net. When Eklund gets it at the goal line, you know he's either going to like look for that slot pass to Toffoli or he's going to try to force the puck on net. You can cover that pretty well. Same goes with Toffoli. If he's not sitting there in the slot looking for that one-timer, he's probably just along the goal line, not really imposing much of a threat. And this goes for almost every single player on the ice, where essentially the power play ended up starting to boil down to give the puck to Celebrini and hope he pulls off like a crazy shot or a crazy cross-ice pass. And even then, because of that being the case, the defensemen, the penalty killers, were well aware of it and could adjust accordingly. And so most of the time, you just didn't really get to see the Sharks managing to accomplish much. Occasionally, they could find some opening. You know, we all can remember that outstanding 5-touch passes against the Montreal Canadiens, which ultimately finished with that Macklin Celebrini goal. That was like the high of the power play this season, but way too often it just wasn't making much of an impact. And the thing is, we have talked about this many times, the Sharks had many one-goal games this season. They lost almost 40 of them on the year. These are games decided by just singular moments, and a lot of the times it's the special teams battle being lost, where the Sharks are either giving up too many goals on the penalty kill or just not scoring any on the power play. These are the difference makers that if the Sharks want to actually be able to win these games more often next season, the special teams are a primary target to improve. And this isn't necessarily personnel-wise. It's not so much that the players were struggling, but the system itself did not really give them the space to work with. It felt just too structured, too kind of cookie cutter, trying to really fit everybody into this tiny box. But that would do it for this surprise and disappointment video. I would say the surprises are much more exciting than the disappointments. Guys like Goodrow and Delandry, at the end of the day, do they really matter all that much? You want to see the players like Celebrini and Smith and Mukhamadullin have some success. So generally, I would say we trended more so towards the positive this season. Class dismissed.